How did westward expansion impact the Native Americans' way of life? Compromises. Until 1887, Native American land was obtained by treaties. Treaties made it hard for white settlers to obtain land while assimilating natives into modern culture, and the House of Representatives were upset they didn't have any control over the treaties. Because of this, a man named Henry Dawes came up with a compromise in which Native Americans would get their own individual sections of land. The government would take the tribal land and divide it into 160-acre land called allotments, and held trust on the land for 25 years, making it so the natives couldn't move to another reservation or tribal land. The government also made the land unsellable so white men couldn't scheme the Native Americans out of their land. This officially declared Native Americans as U.S. citizens because they owned land to farm and live on. Treaties. Treaties were originally made to move the Native Americans off of their land to new, smaller parts of land. They were also promised things like food and guns. Most of these promises were broken, and they were moved to land far less than what they had before. Sometimes natives were forced to sign treaties such as the Removal Act of 1830, in which the Native Americans had to move to reserved land west of the Mississippi, and the U.S. government would help them move there and start their new lives. An example of a treaty is the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux. This treaty was signed in 1851 and is an agreement between the Sisseton and the Wahpeton tribes of the Dakota and the U.S. government. This treaty transferred ownership of most of the land from the Dakota to the United States. This treaty had three major results. First, it ceded most of the southern and western parts of Minnesota for around 7 cents per acre. Second, it provided for reservation of 10 miles on both sides of the Minnesota River. Finally, they arranged to pay the Sisseton and Wahpeton tribes for the land they had ceded. After the chiefs had signed two papers, they were presented with and signed a third. This paper was known as the Fur Traders Paper. This paper stated that the government was going to pay out various debts made by the white man. This was a common thing to do at the time, but the ways the traders got the Native Americans to sign was devious and angered the Native Americans. This added to a list of reasons to not trust the white man. War. The Battle of Little Bighorn was an important battle between the Native Americans and the white man. This battle was fought on June 25, 1876. This battle was fought near the Little Bighorn River in Montana. The groups fighting in this battle were the Cheyenne, the Lakota, Sioux, and Custer with his 7th Cavalry. This battle started because of a number of Native Americans missed the federal deadline to move on a reservation. Custer and his men were outnumbered 1,831 to 90. Custer and his men lost big time, and this battle is also known as Custer's Last Stand. Another example, Native Americans did not like the conditions of the Pine Ridge Reservation. So they did this thing they called a ghost dance, which they thought God would create a new world and kill all non-religious beings, including the non-Indians. Then some white men killed a famous Sioux chief. This raised tensions. Then the Army's 7th Cavalry surrounded a group of ghost dancers under the lead of Chief Bigfoot. The Army wanted them to drop their weapons, then a fight broke out between one of the soldiers and Native Americans. Then a shot was fired, not sure from which side. Then a brutal massacre started right after that shot. An estimated 150 Native Americans were killed from this massacre. The cavalry lost about 25 men. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend took place in 1814. This battle was between Andrew Jackson and the Creek Indians. Not only did Andrew have Europeans, he also had about 600 Native Americans fighting on his side. There were about 1,000 warriors here, along with 350 women and children. They went to the spot to search for refuge from the white man. Andrew Jackson was able to win this war.
Indian reservations were established during the 1850s and 1860s. The American government began declaring specific areas of land in the West as Indian reservations. Two main reasons why they were established: to make more land for the settlers moving west, 2, trying to keep peace between the Indians and the settlers. Most Indians opposed the idea of reservations. The reservations were large. They preferred the larger space they had before, when they had all the area to roam and hunt. During the 1870s and the 1880s, there were many battles fought as Indians in the West resisted the reservation system. Geronimo, a symbol of resistance to reservations, an Apache leader named Geronimo, became famous for his violent resistance against reservations. Apache Indians lived in what is now Arizona and New Mexico. Sitting Bull in the Battle of Little Bighorn. Sitting Bull was a Sioux leader. Most famous conflict involving the Sioux Indians in Montana in 1876. This conflict began when gold was found on the Sioux reservation in South Dakota. The Sioux sat down by the river, defying orders to remain on the reservation. Soldiers from Fort Lincoln were sent to force the Indians back on the reservation. George Custer and about 200 of his soldiers were outnumbered as they approached the camp. He and all his men were surrounded and killed. A great but temporary victory for the Indians. Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce Reservation. One of the saddest conflicts in the West during this period involved the Nez Perce Indians. Known as the Peaceful Tribe, they were made as a treaty of the American government about the size of its homeland. A group of about 800 Nez Perce Indians, led by Chief Joseph, refused to stay on the res with the others of the tribe. As the dispute grew stronger, 4 settlers in the area were killed by the Nez Perce Indians. Chief Joseph did not act in this murder, but he knew it would bring trouble to the tribe, so they fled to Canada. Tribal sovereignty refers to tribes' right to govern themselves, define their own membership, manage tribal property, and regulate tribal business and domestic relations. Native Americans had a government similar to our own that included concepts like fairness and equality for all. The U.S. Constitution was actually modeled after a Native American peace treaty called the Great Law of Peace, and it held an alliance of Indian tribes that was over 400 years old. Since Native American land was considered its own separate state, they had their own rules and laws that were not the same as new American settlers' government. Because of this, Native Americans and American settlers needed to make treaties to settle disputes between land or government, such as treaty as the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act of 1790, which set the boundaries of native land and made it so it could not be sold and was protected against non-native aggression. The death toll of Native Americans was 95 million to 114 million. Genocide or deliberate extermination of one ethnic group by another. In 1837, the Pequot Indians were exterminated by colonists when they burned their villages in Mystic, Connecticut, and then shot all the other people, including men and women who tried to escape. The list of American genocidal policies include mass execution, biological warfare, forced removal from homelands, incarceration, indoctrination of non-indigenous values, forced surgical sterilization of Native women, prevention of religious practices. Not only was the method of massacre used, other methods for Indian removal and clearing included military slaughter of tribal villages, bounties on native scalps. British agents intentionally gave tribes blankets that were contaminated with the smallpox virus. Over 100,000 died among the Mingo, Delaware, Shawnee, and other Ohio River nations. Wounded Knee Massacre. Located on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in southwestern South Dakota, was the site of 2 conflicts between North American Indians and the representatives of the U.S. government. In 1890 massacre left some 150 Americans dead, in what was the final clash between federal troops and the Sioux. In 1973, members of the American Indian Movement occupied Wounded Knee for 71 days to protest conditions on the reservation. Forced removal from homelands. For a brief period after the American Revolution, the U.S. adopted a policy towards American Indians that known as the conquest theory. Most of the Iroquois had gone to Canada, where the English gave them refuge.
Population. Before European settlers came to North America, over 10 million Native Americans were already living there and had been for thousands of years. In the time span between the 1500s and 1800s, about 120 million Native Americans had been killed. Culture. In Native American culture, all living things were considered sacred. Animals were seen as spirits of past family members or loved ones. Every person was assigned as an animal, and that their spirit was absorbed into these animals in death. This is why totem poles were very sacred to the natives, because they expressed their ancestors in animal form. They believed that the sun was a god and the rain was a god. The gods brought the new seasons and the harvest of the crops. When Europeans came to colonize North America, they brought their culture and religion with them, expecting everyone to think what they think. When the natives had their own culture, they were forced to change it. Often children were taken away from their parents and forced into religious schools. In these schools, children were not allowed to speak their native languages and wear their normal clothes. If they refused, they were harshly punished and forced to do manual labor. When they were allowed to see their parents again, their knowledge system had been stripped away, replaced with modern thinking. The Europeans believed in the saying, "Kill the Indian, save the man." They also thought God told them to remove the natives. This also had to do with manifest destiny. Minnesota connection. Minnesota is actually a Native American word by the Siong, meaning cloudy water. When moved after the original land and into reservations, about 9,000 people of Ojibwe ancestry lived in Minneapolis area, and about 3,000 Ojibwe, Dakota, and Winnebago lived in the St. Paul area.
Today's impact. Tribal recognition. There are currently 562 federally recognized tribes today. Most people only think of what Native Americans Americanized to the white man's culture. Yet we forget to think about how much things we borrowed from the Native Americans when we moved onto the new land, including language, government, literature, recreation, medicine, hygiene, and food. Their influence has brought a dramatic change in population sizes, settlement patterns, and men and women's traditional roles.